in personal financial planning that I see that tears people apart, it is estate planning. It's what happens when someone dies. So whether you're single or married, whether you have kids or no kids, whatever it is, this episode's for you. You need to have a plan for when you die. Danny, we are, I think, making our debut episode on the topic of estate planning on this podcast.
Yes, we are. We have not touched on this yet. We've alluded to it a little bit in various episodes,
Sure.
but we've never done a deep dive into it. I say deep dive, but we're actually only going to scratch the surface because it is so complicated.
I am just determined that we can get through this staying as high level as possible, but giving people the tools they need to start thinking about estate planning. Everybody puts this off. If
Yep.
of all the clients I've ever spoken with, of all the friends that have ever approached me or have ever spoken to, they will jump into investments or budgeting or cash flow or saving for college or retirement, everything. But when it comes to estate planning, thinking about their own death, their own mortality, and what's going to happen to their
hmm
assets when they're gone, for whatever reason, this is just one of those topics that is either emotionally difficult for people to confront because it's easier to just put off and ignore it,
Yeah.
or it's just like it feels like too much of a burden to get over that hump. And so you just don't do anything. I cannot tell you how many families I have seen tear apart and stop talking to one another from improper and poor estate planning. Like,
Yep.
I would be willing to wager that the majority of people who have their parents or grandparents die, the majority of cases, and I do mean majority, I don't mean like just over 50%, I mean a very large majority of families end up going into some divisive conflict when it comes
Okay.
to dealing with the death of a family member and how assets end up getting transferred and split up
Yep.
amongst siblings or other family members, whatever it might be.
That's a situation where, we try to talk about money as a tool. We try to view it we try to view it from kind of a functional and utilitarian standpoint, right?
Yeah.
Just money as a tool. It's not something that it shouldn't be your focus in life and just attaining money for the sake of money, right? And I think that when it is connected to estates and inheritance like that, it goes from being a tool to something that is deeply personal during a very emotional time. And that lends itself to causing a lot of damage.
Yeah. There's a book called Beyond the Grave by
Mm,
Jeffrey Condon. I think I'm saying Condon,
okay.
Condon. I don't know how to pronounce that, but hopefully I'm not butchering that. Anyway, this is an estate planning attorney who wrote this book,
Okay.
and I have it. I read it a long time ago. I do need to revisit it, but he very passionately says in the beginning, from his own experience, he's explaining how he's helped so many families. And he gets almost, like, snarky with his attitude. He's like, "I can't tell you how many times I've had a family say, 'Oh, not us. Our sibling our kids are so close. We're such a close family. We're not gonna have
Mm,
issues when we die.'" And he's
okay.
like, "I cannot tell you how many times I've seen the perfect little family completely tear each other's throats out after someone dies because all of these
Yikes.
things come to surface." And I just really want people to start taking this seriously, even if you're a young listener today. Start thinking about what's going to happen when you die, how you want assets to transfer. Because I am telling you, this is if there's any area in personal finance and personal financial planning that I see that tears people apart, it is estate planning. It's what happens when someone dies. So whether you're single or married, whether you have kids or no kids, whatever it is, this episode's for you. You need to have a plan for when you die. Yeah, let's with that out of the way, let's jump in, Danny.
Okay.
I think the first thing I want to set the stage on is understanding probate versus outside of probate, right? So to our
Okay.
listeners, we are not going to do a deep dive into this, but just know that certain assets, if they transfer in a certain way, they may go through a process called probate, which is where the state basically steps in and
It's a court mandated
yep,
process.
court mandated, and it's totally state specific. And
Yeah.
some states can be expensive, some is not. But in general, from my experience and from what I've heard from clients or family members or people who have been through it, it is a total pain in the rear end.
hmm
Like,
It takes a long time.
oh
It's
my gosh,
expensive.
yeah,
The larger your estate, the more expensive it is.
it just causes all kinds of stress, right? Like, you have a family member die, there wasn't very clear it wasn't a clear plan or of action, right? That maybe there weren't proper beneficiaries set up on accounts, and
Mhm.
everything ended up passing through the estate, which goes through the court mandated process of probate. Maybe there wasn't even a will, right? And so now it's an intestacy issue where there's not even any direction for the state
Yeah.
to
I
determine
want
how the heck things transfer to, to who.
I wanted to comment on that, no will. I know we're gonna go into wills, later in the episode,
Sure.
but if there is no will, it means that you are intestate, right? You do not have a will, and it goes through your specific state's intestacy laws.
Hmm.
I think we can pretty much guarantee that if your estate goes through those laws, your assets will not be distributed exactly how you want. So, as an example, I recently looked into a specific state's intestacy laws, and if you were to pass without a will, your spouse would get the first $50,000. Then they would receive 50% of the remainder of your estate, and every single one of your biological children would receive the remaining an equal portion of the remaining 50% of the estate. And that very well may not be how you want your assets distributed if your spouse is still living.
Yeah, and you may hear that formula and go, "Oh, that doesn't sound too bad." It's like you don't understand what the
Yeah.
process looks like. It's messy. The state has to decide for you. It could be a total pain. Usually never goes in accordance with how the person really wanted things to happen after they
Mhm.
died, just like you said. And every state's different, and it can take forever. And there are people, children usually, right, adult children when they're dealing with the death of their parents, who are dealing with intestacy laws or even probate, and it just takes months and months and months. And here you are having to be constantly reminded of your loved one's death because you just can't get things resolved in a quick manner.
Mhm.
And I'm telling you, like, that's not what people want, right? They don't want their heirs to be mired in a bunch of complex issues with the state and dealing with probate or intestacy laws and just not getting things resolved in a timely, clean manner. Nobody wants that for their heirs, right? This is a, a call to action for people to really start getting their things in order. So, not now, I want to say quickly too, you're probably not going to completely avoid probate with everything, right?
Mhm.
There are easy ways to avoid it for a lot of things, but some things are probably inevitably going to pass through it, and that is okay. There's nothing wrong per se with going through probate, but you need to have a plan. And
Yeah.
for a lot of people, it is optimal to maybe have a lot of things avoided if you can, in a clean manner. So let's jump into the first thing, Danny, which is before you even get into like plan of action, you have to start with your goals, right? So I actually want to talk through these with you,
Okay.
and I'll actually share some stories where I can of things I've encountered, whether it's been like clients I've faced, planned with in the past, or even just stories I know from family members or friends, right? So I think the first one is like, who do you want to inherit your assets, right? Like when you die, is it one person? Is it multiple people? And then speaking of that, like how much do you want each person to inherit? Is it going to be
Mhm.
equal amounts? Is it going to be unequal? And then kind of tying to that point, and we'll address these all together in a second. Are there any specific assets you want to leave to one person versus another, or vice versa, whatever that might be? It's really this puzzle piece of like, what do you have? Who's it going to be passing to, and in what amounts? And is everyone going to be inheriting everything equally, or will some people get certain types of assets and some people get other certain types of assets? Now, there's all kinds of issues with this, Danny. I mean, let me give you an example. Let's say there are multiple kids in a family, right? Maybe there's three siblings, and the parents want to leave an inheritance to them, but one sibling is still living close to their parents, and the other two moved away due to life. Maybe they married someone and families took them elsewhere. And that one sibling who's living closer to those parents maybe ends up having a larger demand on their time and perhaps even on their finances
Mhm.
to have to take care of that parent or like check in on them and go over and help them clean. Maybe their health starts to decline. And one of the siblings inadvertently ends up having more demand on their time than others, right?
Sure.
How do you rectify that? Do you give them a larger inheritance? Are the other siblings okay with that? Have you even started having that discussion with your three kids in this scenario, right? Like, It's really important to think about these things. It's these emotional things. It's these family dynamics that end up coming into the picture. It's those dynamics that if they're not addressed and talked about early on, and there's not like an agreement amongst everybody how that's going to happen, as soon as that person dies, it's going to tear the family apart because once
Pandemonium.
it's just total chaos because
Yeah.
for whatever reason, when it comes to money, people just throw all of their, morals and character out the window and they feel self-righteous about things. And I'm not judging anyone. It's we're all susceptible to it. I have
I'm
seen it.
judging people a little bit.
Well, the sad truth is that like Danny, you and I could also be susceptible to be less than savory in our character, right? Under the right
Okay.
circumstances. When people die and there's disagreements amongst surviving heirs, it can really cause a lot of heartache and a lot of disagreement. So another example, right? So I remember there was a client I was working with. They had a couple rental properties in addition to like an IRA and a bunch of invested
Okay.
assets,
Yep.
and they had multiple kids. And one of the kids said had expressed a very strong interest in maintaining those rental properties. They were even helping out. I think they even had a rental property of their own. And so
Okay.
it made logical sense, like because the other siblings didn't have any interest in rental properties. Like, I don't want
Yeah.
to deal with renters, but one of the siblings did. And so the estate plan was to leave like the rental properties to this one child, but then leave the IRAs and some of the investments to the other kids. And so
Okay.
now you have very different types of assets being inherited by the other people. And the problem with that scenario, one of the cons, is that you have no idea how the rental properties versus the invested assets in the markets are going to appreciate or depreciate in value
Yeah.
between now and when the parents ultimately die. And while they may leave it, it's roughly equal now in today's dollars. By the time they die 10, 20, 30 years from now, you could end up with wildly different values in the estate going to kids because you weren't
Mhm.
accounting for the difference in those assets and how they may behave differently over the coming decades in terms of appreciation, right?
Now, there are ways to create in your will and in your estate planning, to create some stop gaps and some uh, solutions for those issues if they do come to pass.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ones you could do if there was an issue like the one I just described where somebody's going to inherit these real properties and other heirs are going to inherit, liquid investments. One way to avoid the issue of by the time the parents die, if the assets are wildly different in valuation, you could just say, "Hey, to avoid that risk, we're gonna have everything go to our kids equally, so the rental properties will be inherited equally by all the siblings, despite the fact that one is much more interested in renting them and maintaining them than the others. But we need to have a plan, express a plan that we want the other siblings who may not have an interest in those rental properties to then be required to sell their proportional share to the child who wants to run the rental property. So that the kid who wants to keep the rental properties has to buy out their siblings, right?
Mm.
Well, in order to do that, there also has to be enough liquidity from other
Yep.
assets so that they can actually do that and not be left with, be in a pinch where it's like, well, yeah, I want to keep the rental property, so I have to buy out my brother and sister, but I hardly have any money to do so. Now I have to take out debt, and I'm stressed about this, and that can cause turmoil and disagreement with the siblings, right? So if you are somebody now listening to this and you're thinking like, oh, maybe I would have a situation like that, it doesn't have to necessarily be a rental property. It could be any type of like asset where maybe one's illiquid and one's not. You should be thinking ahead of like, how can I make sure that everyone inherits things equally and an equal value so it's fair, but also be able to tackle something like an illiquidity issue where one child wants to maintain something like a rental property or a business maybe. Maybe there's a family business that's not exactly liquid.
Yeah.
How am I going to have something in place to make sure that they have the cash liquidity available to buy each other out, right? Or sell their proportion to another sibling. Like that's something
Absolutely.
you have to be thinking about.
And for those
So,
of you that are new to the show, a liquid asset would be something like a publicly traded stock or a publicly traded
right.
ETF. An illiquid asset is something like a home, a rental property that cannot be
Yeah.
easily
Land.
sold.
Right.
Yes, land.
Land,
Yeah,
even a closely held family business, right? If
absolutely.
there's a closely held family business, those aren't easy to sell because they're very specific. You have to find the right buyer who's familiar with that business. So it becomes a whole complex puzzle, right?
Mhm.
And it doesn't even have to be that complex either. There are meaningful decisions to make even with regular assets, right? So let's say you have a savings account, which is like a big emergency fund. You also have a brokerage account with stocks in it and market assets. You also have a traditional IRA, right? Like maybe a traditional retirement account that has a bunch of pre-tax dollars in it, right? So it's fully taxable to you when you take withdrawals. I've also seen situations, Danny, where a client has maybe like I don't know. I'm going to use easy numbers here: 100,000 in savings, 100,000 in a stock portfolio, and 100,000 in a traditional IRA, right? And they go,
Okay.
"Well, I've got 3 kids, so I'll I'll leave I'll leave one to one and one to the other, and then one to the other," right? Well,
Yeah.
what you just did is you left one of the assets, the traditional IRA, to a child who's now going to inherit it and is gonna owe 100% taxes on it when they withdraw from
Mhm.
it, and they're gonna have to deal with inherited IRA required minimum distributions and all of that headache. But the other 2 kids got a bank account, which is fully liquid and not taxable to them, and a stock
Yep.
portfolio, which has a step up in basis, which is also not taxable to them, right? So,
Exactly, yeah.
it's like now
So
yes.
one of the 3,
Yeah.
crazy taxes, and everyone else got away with just free money.
Yeah, yeah, it's like, yes, they were quote unquote "equal dollar amounts," but the
Yeah,
after tax result, after the child would even be able to access it, ends up meaning that one child inadvertently ends up with fewer assets because of a tax liability that they were subject to that the others were not, right? And so
very true.
it's just things like that. It's good to be mindful of those elements when you are thinking about the distribution of assets after you die. And, this applies to anybody, whether you're married or not, whether you have kids or not, right? Um, just start thinking about who do I want to inherit things? How do I want to make sure it happens in a fair manner so that I remove as many possible conflicts as I can? It's probably impossible to remove every conceivable conflict,
Mhm.
but what can I do to get as many of them mitigated as possible? Right? I think that's
Very
the
true.
the thing to be thinking about. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah. So I think switching gears, Danny, to another question is I think this one's actually harder for people to think about. How do you want things to be handled if you become incapacitated? This is a tough one. I mean, let's say somebody becomes totally disabled and they go into a coma and they go into a vegetable state and they may never regain consciousness or cognitive function again, right?
Yep.
That is a terrifying nightmare for anyone to have to think about putting themselves in and what they would want to happen after that. But it's a prudent thing to do, right? Like if I become totally incapacitated, who do I want to have the power to make medical and financial decisions on my behalf, right? Think about the amount of trust you have to have in a person to do that and that they will do it in accordance with your wishes. That is a profoundly difficult thing to think about, especially in something like our age, right, Danny? We're young. Like I'm 35. I can't even fathom being in that situation.
Yep.
But I still need to think about it because people in our age group do unfortunately become victim to, horrible outcomes. Maybe it's just a bad accident or some circumstance or a medical issue or an illness, right? How do you handle that, right? And I mean, the way you do that is you got to start thinking about who in your family. Maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's a close sibling, maybe it's it could be a parent, right? If you're young and your parents are still sufficiently young and they would potentially be alive if you were to become incapacitated. They could be a backup plan. It's a difficult question. I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know how to answer it for people because it's going to be very
It's gonna be
personal.
very personal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gosh, I mean, it gets down to things like, do you want to be on life support? Do you want
Mhm.
to be fed through feeding tubes? Do you want to be resuscitated? Do you want to be kept alive as long as possible? You could even get specific. It's like if there is a consensus among, several doctors that I have less than a 10% chance of surviving or being brought back from some type of thing, then just, do not resuscitate. Don't keep me
Yep.
alive. Don't put me on life support. But if there's a greater than 10% chance, then maybe do it. Like it becomes very ambiguous. It's a gray area, right? And so have to think about that stuff. And it's tough. It's really,
Yeah.
really tough. But
Definitely. Leading into, or continuing on from both that incapacity and disability and, those occurrences of your autonomy and your decision making, being taken away from you due to medical issues, accidents, etc. The next aspect that you need to worry about if you have children is who do you want to take care of your children,
Yep.
right? Who is the best option, the best selection to care for your children in your absence?
Yeah, this is a really interesting one too, and I think a lot of people would be quick to just think like, "Oh, well, my family would step in." Like I have a sister
Hmm.
or I have a brother or I have a my mom or dad would or an aunt and uncle, right? That's okay, I think, for a starting point, but I do think there are deeper philosophical questions to ask yourself. I would be thinking about like, what person would raise my child and take care of them in a way that is philosophically aligned with how I also want to take care of them, right?
Mm, okay.
Like in my case, right? My son was born, this past January. My wife and I are very adventurous. We want to give him like a certain type of life. We
Okay.
have certain um, principles we believe in that we share very deeply. And when it comes to thinking about somebody who would take care of our minor child as a guardian after we die, if we die an early, untimely death, I want that person to represent some of the same values that we hold dear, right?
That makes sense.
Right? Like, that's something I need to be thinking about is like,
Yeah.
who would have the capacity to raise my child and take care of them in the same or similar manner that I would want to, right? I do think that's an important question, right?
Yeah. You need
Um,
to think about beliefs. You need to think about
yeah,
temperament, situation, financial status,
hmm,
and stability. There
yeah.
are so many different requirements and aspects to consider before you make that decision.
Oh, yeah, and I think this is another area that doesn't get talked about much. Like, my wife and I have been approached before. Somebody has asked us, like, "Hey, would you be willing to take care of our child?"
Okay.
Whether that's like, actually raise them, or I have also been approached by a friend that said, "Would you be willing to, from a financial standpoint, guide our child if we pass away? Would you be like
Hmm.
a resource for them
Yeah.
to help them with their finances?" And I said, "Of course," right? Like, but there is another thing here that you should consider. Understand the profound request you are making
Yeah.
by asking someone to be the guardian of your child. And ask yourself this: do you have a way to financially compensate that person? You know what it's like to be a parent, the absolute demand on your time and your resources. Do you think that's going to stop with you when you die? And that the person who's going to be the guardian is just going to kind of step in your shoes? If they do not have the financial wherewithal or the capacity or bandwidth, it's something to consider. I don't know. That may be unpopular opinion, but when I'm thinking about it, it's like I think I may put something in the plan where there is some portion of money carved out to help compensate for the burden of time and finances, right? Like
Sure.
kids cost money and they also cost time. And I want to make
Yeah.
sure,
A portion of the life insurance could go to that.
yeah, something like
Yeah.
that. Um, it's just something to be aware of, right? Like it's a very serious question and it's a big decision. So, speaking of children too, Danny, I think this is a good segue into another one. Every child is different. Every child has different financial tendencies to either save or spend, either diligently or recklessly, right?
Yeah.
That becomes another puzzle piece to be thinking about. It's not so much on my mind right now, given my son's not even a year old yet, so he's not exactly a what's the term we came up with? A budgeting master. Um, gosh, I'm forgetting the term.
A number crunching budget master.
Thank you. He's not a number crunching budget master currently.
Another one that I enjoy that's going on the merch is fiscal wizard.
He's definitely not a fiscal wizard. Um, he he's a wizard of like putting every random object in his mouth at this
Yep.
point in time.
Sounds
But
about right.
but I'm thinking about that, right? It's like if you are listening to this, right, and you have a child, maybe multiple children, or you plan to, think about that future scenario, right? If you die and your children are in their teens or even just a young adult, are you just gonna let all of your assets be inherited by them outright? Are you comfortable with that? Or do you want there to be some type of tiered schedule where they get access
Yep.
to a certain amount at age 20 and then maybe at age 35 and then again at age 45 or whatever it might be? Um, and that's just something to be thinking about. Um, That gets more into some trust planning where you really do have to get an
Mhm.
attorney to, like, spell that out and how that's gonna be handled, but it's something to be mindful of, right? And I can't tell you how many kids, um I don't know if this is, like, an echo of the issue with people who win lotteries. It's not the same issue, but, like, there are a lot of children, heirs who inherit, the money from their deceased parents and blow a lot of it. Like,
Okay.
it's just not handled prudently. It's not everybody,
Yep.
but generational wealth is actually very difficult to keep, right? It is actually hard
Yeah.
um, for surviving generations to actually maintain that wealth because the temptation to spend and blow it is just so profound. And so,
I feel like what I've seen a lot is people saying that it's typically gone by the 3rd generation,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. I know there's some stats on it. We should look them up later, but yeah, so that's something to be mindful of. And Danny, this is another one too. It's like I've seen this with clients where, gosh, it's really sad. Had a client that I used to work with at an old firm I was at. They the man had ended up remarrying because a spouse had died, right? So,
Alright.
so remarried. His priorities with how the finances would be transferred after
Mhm.
he died ended up having a conflict with his now second spouse, but also his children, right?
Okay.
And so there's this question of like, gosh, what did his first spouse want, right? Would
Yeah.
she have been okay with some of their assets ultimately not going into the hands of her kids because a now second spouse is now entering the picture and they may want a claim or a stake in those
Mhm.
assets, right?
Yeah.
And
I
so,
mean, if you have children from a prior relationship
yeah.
and you remarry, there are very specific actions that you need to take and things that need to be spelled out in order to make sure that your children are protected and that everything is distributed as you hope.
Yeah,
And,
it
trusts and, making sure your will is clearly spelled out. And also, as we've, I think, briefly touched on before, prenuptial agreements.
yeah, and just good trust planning too
Yeah.
with, this is one of those areas where you definitely need an attorney and some trust planning, with a trust. Yeah, but this is a hard one to think about, Danny. It's like, I guess I'll put myself in the hot seat for a second, but, like, I find it near impossible that this would ever happen, but I acknowledge it could, right? Like, I could die. Of course, I would want my wife to move on and hopefully find love again, right? I don't want her to be a widow for the rest of her life. Like, I want her to have companionship. I want someone to be there for her. I also have to envision a scenario where she could, in this hypothetical scenario, fall in love with somebody after I die and have just as much of a romantic, passionate, loving relationship that
Mhm.
that she has with me, right? Like, and I would, if I'm being intellectually honest, I'd want that for her, emotionally honest, right? But then there's a potential conflict, right? Like, my wife loves me as much as she loves our child. Our assets are our assets. I have to expect that that similar scenario could come to fruition in the future if I were to die and she were ultimately to find love again and another relationship. She could be back in a situation where there's this unclear boundary of like, hey, she now values this second spouse just as much as she valued me, right? And how does that conflict with the financial goals of wanting my child to be taken care of, right? Because that
Yeah.
future spouse may not does not have the bias that my wife and I do towards our child. That future spouse is
Absolutely.
probably not going to. They may love our child, right? But maybe not in the same way, right? And so there's a risk that they don't in the same way. Maybe they also have kids of their own, and they have an interest in maybe having some of those assets go to their kids, right?
Mhm.
It's a difficult it's difficult to think about this type of scenario, right? And it's even
Yeah.
uncomfortable, right? I'm even getting a little uncomfortable thinking about it, but it's one of those things you gotta confront. You have to think about, like, is it unlikely? Yes, but not as unlikely as you would imagine. I know people who have been in this situation, who have lost a spouse and then ultimately ended up remarrying, and they had kids with the deceased spouse, right? At least put it on the radar. At least start talking about it, right? Like, this is something that I think is a good thing to at least think about these scenarios because this is where estate planning gets tricky. It really is. It's a tough
Yeah.
puzzle. But
You're planning for future unknowns,
yeah,
and you have to have a lot of contingent plans and actions set up within that estate plan in order to account for all these things that may happen, may not happen.
yeah,
You know, a good plan will be set up to help guide your family through things that were unexpected.
yeah. I think that's the best you can do in this situation when trying to build an estate plan is just try
Yeah.
to plan for those unexpected things as honestly and prudently as you can. Another one really quick too, Danny, before we move on, is belongings, right? We
Mhm.
talk about like homes and land and invested assets and cash, but like what about all your heirlooms? What about all your little I have a lot of collectibles, right?
And you
Like
know what? Let's be honest. These these belongings, you know, real property, physical property,
yeah.
are the most common thing to be inheriting because not everyone is in the upper tiers and investing in assets.
Yeah.
Not everyone's going to be inheriting, an investment account or rental property, but everybody will be inheriting some form of physical belonging.
Yeah. I actually think this is could a lot of physical belongings tend to have a lot of emotional, sentimental
Yeah.
value, between parents and kids, right? This is one of those areas where I've seen people, their parents die and they're going through all the belongings, the physical belongings, and they're like getting teary eyed and
Yeah.
very emotional when looking at them. Those things often do have great financial value too, but there's also like a much deeper, like, emotional root to it. And so I think it's important to spell out your wishes regarding your belongings. Like, talk to your kids, like, or if you have no kids, maybe siblings or friends, right? Just get a sense of like who really wants this type of heirloom or collectible or this belonging, and how
Hmm.
can I divide them up in a manner that's fair and equitable to my kids? I want to throw another side note in there too, Danny. In my case, because I have collectibles that have value that I buy and sell, some of these collectibles require a specific knowledge and
Hmm.
skill set in order
Yep.
to appropriately sell them and render the value that they're actually worth on the market when you sell them. And if you don't have that skill set or even knowledge of where to go, where to begin, what ultimately happens is a lot of kids will inherit collectibles that actually have quite a bit of value. But
Hmm.
because they just have no plan in place or any knowledge or skill on it, they just end up like, we don't want these. Let's just get rid of them and sell them. And they sell them for literally an absolute fraction of what they're worth.
Yeah. Pennies on the
Yep.
dollar. That's why so many people find great deals at
Oh
estate
my
sales.
gosh. It's like highway robbery. Like
Yeah.
you can find something and people will buy things for 1/100th of the value and sell it for 10 or 100x, right? Like it's really important. So I guess the point here is like if you are someone that has collectibles or valuables that have a market, but it's very niche and specific, you need to have a plan where you either train your kids and get them acquainted with it before you die so they know how to handle it and get the value they deserve from it, or have a plan to have somebody, an outside third party, come in to actually help with
Yeah.
that. But don't leave your heirs um, high and dry with no plan and no idea of what to do with the collectibles because they may end up just selling them off for an absolute fraction of what they're worth. So anyway, thought I'd throw that out there.
Yeah. It made me think your heirs may have no idea what to do with your enormous uranium china collection. Like, what those, uranium ceramics that glow under a black light?
Oh yeah, there's got to be a very specific market where you auction those and
Yeah.
whatnot. So yeah, make sure you have an expert that they can contact. So, but all of that aside, everything we just talked about, the assets, one person or multiple people, incapacity issues, who makes financial and medical decisions for you, who's going to take care of your minor children, how you want assets to become available to your children, what happens if your spouse remarries, your physical belongings, all of those things. Write or this down or type it up. Like
Mhm.
any discussion you have with your spouse or significant other, or if you're alone and an individual unmarried, still write it up. Write up what your wishes are. Get it on paper, get it organized, have a sense of some path that you want to take under certain scenarios, because that's going to be the starting point to make sure that when you actually start getting the estate plan implemented, you're going to get the right ducks in a row to make it
Yeah.
happen. And quite frankly, having that stuff typed up on a document even if you didn't get around to getting your estate plan, set up, that's still gonna be better than nothing, right? Like, because in some states, having a typed up letter, as long as maybe if there was like a proper verification, like there was a witness who
Mhm.
could testify that this was indeed your wishes, then that's gonna help. It's a lazy plan, and it's not one you should
Yeah,
rely on. But
and it's
it's
not the same thing as a will, as
no.
a properly executed will.
Yes. Yeah, that's gonna require an attorney actually writing up a last will and testament. Now, in some states, a typed up document that you made can actually count as a will, but, like,
As
I
long as you follow specific, policy and rules that are laid out within
yeah.
that state's legislation.
Yeah, let me put it this way, I'm not comfortable rolling the dice that my
Yeah.
typed up letter is gonna count as a will in my state, right?
I
I'm
wrote
gonna
my
get
will out in crayon, signed it with a finger paint fingerprint.
now you're really, really spelling credibility with that will.
Yeah.
They're definitely gonna
Yeah.
believe you. It's a valid will in that case. But yeah, let's move on, Danny. I think that's the first thing is, like, start with your goals, go through those deep questions. Second thing, get your beneficiaries in order. Going
Yeah.
back to the probate versus outside of probate issue, a lot of things in probate can be avoided if you just have
Mhm.
good beneficiary planning. So, what do we mean by
Yep.
this? Make sure your IRA, your Roth IRA, traditional, your 401ks, your 403bs, your TSPs, if you work in the government through a savings plan, whatever retirement accounts, individual retirement accounts you have, your life insurance policies, whether it's an individual policy you own or an employer group policy, make sure you have the proper beneficiaries listed on those assets that in the event of your death, it's going to this person. And if you're going to split it amongst multiple people, make sure it's split up with, 50% to this person and
Yep.
50% to that person. If you're afraid the person you want to inherit it might die soon after you do, or you want to have a successive beneficiary in case, you can have a primary beneficiary and a contingent beneficiary, right? You can list these things out. And the cool thing about a beneficiary is that it completely avoids probate. You don't go
Yes.
through all of the state stepping in. It is very immediate. The beneficiary in the account is who's getting that asset.
Mhm.
No
I
questions
wanna
asked.
call out 2 aspects to that as well. So one thing in avoiding probate, let's say you have a $1,000,000 investment account and you have a beneficiary listed for that account.
Mhm.
That $1,000,000 has been removed from the probate estate and therefore has lowered your overall, size of the estate going through probate and lowers the, amount of fees and administrative costs that you will pay on it.
That's a really good point. I want to clarify. It doesn't remove your assets from your estate, which would be subject to estate taxes.
From the
But for
probate
yes,
estate, not the
correct.
gross
Yeah,
estate.
that's a really
Yep.
good point.
The
Um,
second thing
yeah,
regarding beneficiaries is anytime you have an update, a new event in your life, you need to update all of your beneficiaries to ensure that they are set up how you want your assets to flow because your beneficiary designations will override and negate what you have written in your will.
oh, that is such a good point. I'll take it a step further.
Yep.
It'll override and negate anything written in a trust by an attorney. If you have an IRA and you have a person named as a beneficiary,
Mhm.
but in your trust document, which was meticulously crafted by an attorney, and you spent, probably a couple grand on it, right? Says I was about to do an impersonation. I hereby declare that thy this person nameth. That's not how wills and trusts are written. I make fun of it because legalese is impossible to read for me.
Yeah.
But if even if the trust or your will declares that another person was meant to get that IRA, does not matter. That beneficiary on the IRA is getting it. If even if it was
Yep.
a different person that was named in your will or trust.
Yeah, even if it was an ex-spouse that you haven't spoken to in 30 years.
Yep. You can try to contest it all you want. You can hire all the attorneys you want to try and fight it in court. It's very unlikely that you're going to win. Like the beneficiary listed is who it's going to. Um, there are obviously anomalies or certain cases where things may be different,
Exceptions. Yeah.
exceptions to the rule. But like I think for the general listener today, just assume that the beneficiary listed on an account is going to trump any will you have. Right? That's just the way it's going to be. So make sure you have those beneficiaries listed. Some accounts may not have something called a beneficiary. You may have to do something called a transfer on death for like your checking or savings, and maybe even some brokerage accounts. It more or less accomplishes the same thing as a
Yeah.
beneficiary listing. It's a little bit different. I think the moral is like if you want to avoid it, like having to go through state probate issues, you want it to be a clean transfer to somebody or multiple people. Check to see if you can do a transfer on death. Here's the big one. You already alluded to it too, Danny, like a ex-spouse. Remember to update your beneficiaries if things change. I cannot tell you how common this is. Somebody's married to someone, they end up getting a divorce, they remarry, and lo and behold, they forgot to check the freaking beneficiary on their group term life insurance policy that was set up a decade ago, that they completely forgot had their ex-spouse listed as the beneficiary. And then that person dies, and then the ex-spouse gets the money and not the current
Yep.
spouse, right? If there's a if somebody dies, I've seen this before. There's a beneficiary listed, and that beneficiary dies, and it was set up so long ago that the person forgot to update it to a new beneficiary, and then they die, and it says, "Well, it's going to this person." Oh, that person's already dead. Well, it's going to your estate, and it's gonna go through
Yep.
probate now. Here's another one. I've seen somebody have an asset with their 2 kids as a beneficiary. Then they had a 3rd child, and they forgot to get their beneficiary updated to account for that new child, right? The point is, make it an annual or every 6 months. You don't even have to open up all your accounts per se. Just ask yourself, "Hey, has anything changed with our family dynamics in any way that we need to account for updating the beneficiaries?" I mean, it could even be, I hate to say this, but it could even be like maybe you have a falling out with a
Mhm.
family member or a friend or whatever it is, and it is no longer your wish to leave money to that person, but you just simply forgot to change them.
Yeah.
That's not even necessarily a change to the family, like a material change. It's just like it's a relationship emotional change, right? Like, think about those things. Remember to periodically check on these things because it is so common for people to forget to update their beneficiaries. Now,
Yeah, if you find out a family member is an international criminal, maybe remove them from the beneficiary designations.
or maybe they have a horrible gambling problem and
Yes.
they've blown all of their life savings because they can't help. They're addicted to gambling, right? Like
Yeah.
there could be all kinds of issues. Maybe they have, I hate to say this, this is really sad. But maybe they have a really difficult mental illness that makes them incapable of handling finances.
Mhm.
It's hard, I know, but like, do be thinking about these things. They
Yeah,
all
and there
play a
are
role.
there are things such as support trusts and having, other trustees make those determinations of
Yeah.
support needed for those people that can help with those things.
Yeah, you can have like spendthrift provisions
Yep.
in a trust that prevent people from just spending all of the assets. There are like a lot of guardrails put in. Some people will have trusts set up where it's called HEMS. Distributions can only be used for health, education, maintenance, and support.
Yep.
HEMS. There's all kinds of things you could do, but the point is, you're not going to know how to do that. You're going to, if you have really complex estate planning needs like that, you absolutely need to get an attorney. But at least be aware of these issues, right? If you can even entertain the questions in your mind and they start to make you concerned about a particular strategy, well, then you already know what direction you need to go. Then you already know what you want to bring up to the attorney when you talk to them, because you have a plan of action, at least a rudimentary one in place. And then, of course, the attorney or the professional can help you polish it and fine tune it to your exact liking. But
Absolutely.
um, the third thing we'll talk about is once you've gone through those first two steps, start getting your documents in order, right? Like if we said it earlier, type everything up. It may or may not count as a valid will, but at least it's a start, right? And then you can actually go about getting a will. There are kind of three tiers. Like the first is you do your own will, which is quite questionable as to whether or not it's going to be
Yep.
valid. The second one is you go through like an online provider where you
Okay.
can actually do it all online, and it gives you like a state specific will. From my understanding, those types of providers, the quality of the estate planning documents you're getting is not going to match working with an estate planning attorney and like having them
Sure.
specifically draft documents for you. But from my understanding, it's certainly better than doing it yourself. And
Much better than a
um,
crayon written will. Yes.
yes, I'm going to try to get my son to make a will. It'll be a crayon written. Wow, I can't even speak. Written will. It's probably going to say something like, "I want all of my cookies to go to our cat. because I love my cat, and that's probably gonna be the will, as far as I know. I don't know.
Sounds
But
good.
yeah. But yeah, so and then the third is, of course, working with an attorney, right? That's gonna
Yeah.
be the most surefire way. I think the big thing here is make sure it is an attorney who actually has a specialty in estate planning, that it's something they are familiar with and they do. You would be surprised how many attorneys will happily jump on and say, "Oh, I can definitely help you with your estate plan."
Okay.
And then they just end up using boilerplate,
Yeah.
drafts of
M
documents. Um,
Meanwhile, they're primarily a public defense attorney or
right.
something.
Yeah, and the moral is just make sure it's an attorney that is actually that works in estate planning. That's the
Yeah,
big thing. You'll want to get a power of attorney for financial and medical setup, right? That's an important thing. What
and those are different.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. Who's gonna be responsible for making financial decisions on my behalf if I become incapacitated? And the same for medical, who's gonna be responsible for making
Mhm.
those? Um,
And those are 2 very different things. You will not necessarily have the same person being ideal for both, right? I
Good
think
point.
it's pushed pretty heavily that the person making the medical decisions, right, needs to have your best health interest in mind and, tends to be the person that is more aligned with caretaking.
Yeah,
And the person that you have looking over your finances, you want them to have a at least a decent grasp of finance and how to best manage and take care of those assets.
absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point. Don't just assume you can just name one person, right? Think about
Yeah.
the individual objective of what these are each trying to accomplish, and then act appropriately. Choose the right person for the right job. There's something else called an advanced medical directive. Sometimes you'll hear it called a living will, and that is actually the document that lists out how you actually want to be taken care of in certain circumstances. Like, are you going to be resuscitated? Are you going to be put on life support and fed through a feeding tube and those types of things?
Yeah.
There are good questionnaires out there, and I don't have any available on the spot, but you can Google it. I've seen questionnaires that go through a laundry list of things where it's like, what would you want to happen in this situation? What would you want to happen in this situation? And it's like really challenging questions.
Hmm.
Like it probes you to like think about really uncomfortable scenarios. But again, the more that you think about that and that you can write it down and get that into a document that spells out your wishes, the better. And then lastly is like some type of revocable trust planning for some of those more complex planning needs, like the
Hmm.
future spouse, right? If you die and your spouse remarries, or like you have children or multiple children, and how they gain access to the assets and in what amounts and at what
Yeah.
ages. Are some children very fiscally irresponsible, or do you have to have certain guardrails for those children and things like that?
And we're not going
So
to dive into it too much,
no.
but with a revocable trust, all those assets will still be in your gross estate, but they will avoid probate and that court process.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. We're not even going to get into irrevocable trusts and
Yep.
trying to avoid estate tax. Like our
What
listeners
are the
will,
tax implications for each of these trust setups?
yeah, we don't want to put our
That'll be the
listeners to
next
sleep.
10 episodes.
Buckle up, everybody. Hope you're ready.
Oh, no, we're gonna put those trust episodes on the sleeping app, right?
Yes, the financial whispers in your
Those will put
ear.
you to sleep for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh man, I have a feeling that financial therapy sleeping app where we just spew nonsense that's so boring that people go to sleep. I think that's going to blow up. We're probably going to be very financially successful with that one.
Gosh, it's
So
so ridiculous.
yeah. Anyway, so some closing thoughts. I think to our listeners, the point of this episode is to really help you get a high level understanding of the questions you need to be asking yourself, and all of the different elements you should be considering that fit into the puzzle of estate planning, right? Get some of the basics going. Start discussing it with your spouse. And if you don't have a spouse, maybe with a close family member or friend, whoever you think is going to be involved in helping you with that.
Mhm.
Um, Explore these scenarios with your family and significant other. Have discussions. Gosh, if there's anything I want people to take away from this is start having conversations about this. If you want to avoid as much heartache and splitting a family as you can, trust me when I say this. If you choose not to have open, candid discussions about this, if you cannot confront this because you're too uncomfortable or you're too scared and you're nervous of how the other people are going to react, get over it. I'm sorry. Get over it. I've seen too many people split apart. It is really hard to deal with the aftermath when people have not been having communication about what's going to happen when you pass away.
Yeah.
Start having a conversation today with your loved ones. Get a plan in place. and you will thank me later. Well, or maybe you won't. Your heirs
It
will thank us later.
if you don't do this, it would be a very, very sad and avoidable fate of, the family breaking apart because no one can determine who gets your coffee table after you pass.
Yeah. Exactly.
Everybody
Um,
loves grandpa's coffee table.
I'm laughing. There's some family members, on my wife's side of the family, and, her grandpa passed away.
Mhm.
And there wasn't fortunately, they didn't have any issues, but it was almost like tongue in cheek, they were laughing. He had this Her grandpa had this, a tissue box. Like, you put the tissue box in it, and it was like a
Okay.
stone face, and you pulled the tissues out of the stone's nose. Like, it was
Oh,
hilarious.
interesting. Alright.
Everybody loved this thing, right? And they, like, jokingly were all like, "Oh, yeah, we're gonna be getting in a fight over who gets the tissue box when he dies," because everybody loves this thing, and lo and behold, when he passed away, like, ended up at one person's house, and there's just an ongoing joke of, like, somebody's probably gonna steal it, and it's gonna end up at somebody
Mm.
else's house. So, anyway,
Just trade it every year. Yeah.
yeah,
Ship it.
but you know what was really cool is that her family had an open discussion about they had open candid discussions about this,
Mhm.
even if it was just a tissue box, right? The fact that they could laugh about it afterward, if anything, just use that as an example of like inspiration. If you can start discussing this with your loved ones early on, the more likely everyone's going to be on the same page and in good
Yeah.
spirits about how you are going to handle the estate when somebody passes away. Obviously, to our listeners, if you're listening to this, this is going to be your heirs, right? But like, if you, as a parent or the person who's planning for your own death, right? If you can start discussing it with your loved ones and your significant other, the chances of you having a successful outcome when you pass away and your family staying together and things happening as you wish, the chances increase substantially,
Yes.
truly substantially. And most people like to put it off because it's uncomfortable, but don't be that person. If anything, use this as inspiration to start having the conversation today. And of course, last but not least, work with a professional, especially if you need some more complex planning. Don't roll the dice with this one.
Yeah. Don't leave it to chance.
Yeah,
This is far too complex and complicated to wing it and just hope for the best.
yeah, exactly. Man, that was a that was fun. That was a lot.
Yeah. Good conversation.
Yeah, I hope everyone got something out of this.